Good evening. I just want to welcome you all here to Queen's and Riddle Hall today. So my name is David Rooney and I'm a Professor of Chemical Engineering right here at Queen's University. I'm also a Dean in the faculty looking at internationalisation for engineering and physical sciences. But of course I'm really proud to welcome you all here today to celebrate and to enjoy the 21st annual Sir Bernard Crossland lecture with our guest speaker and friend Keith Bell, which again is hosted once again by the Chief Executives Club at Queen's, Engineers Ireland, and of course in association with the Institution for Engineering and Technology. You may have had the pleasure of attending one of these annual events in the past, which has been named in honour of our late colleague, Sir Bernard Crossland, a man of passion and commitment who made a lifelong contribution in so many ways to engineering and to society. These lectures began back in 2001 with a strong steer from Professor Sir Bernard Crossland himself. He never actually fully retired. He played a key role in the organisation of those first 11 lectures in that series, before his death in 2011. That small organisation committee that he sat on is delighted to continue on that work today in recognition of, of the work that he has now done. And I'd particularly like to thank Jonathan Hagan, chair of that committee, for all of that work that he has been doing over the last number of years, as well as the other committee members who also serve with him. Indeed, I'm delighted to see so many friends and colleagues of Sir Bernard here tonight and share those anecdotes and those stories. And I'd like to also extend a particularly warm welcome to his daughter, Mary Ann, and her husband, Darius, who's joined us all the way from Cork. Since the lectures began, they've played a key role in developing and nurturing links between Queen's and industry, particularly in engineering. As an institution, we are very proud of the work that Queen's has been doing and continuing to make a major impact on the economy here in Northern Ireland and globally. We play a leading role in the innovation pillar of the Innovation Belfast Regional City deal, a deal that will be a springboard to the creation of thousands of new, highly skilled jobs in a knowledge economy, leveraging more than £220 million worth of investment in advanced manufacturing, health research, data science, and creative industries. The leading role that the university has been able to do has been exemplified even recently in an independent report by London Economics, which put the university's economic impact, or valued it, in the region of £3 billion. And of this, our research and knowledge exchange activities accounted for almost £1.2 billion. As an anchor institution, we have a key role to play as a civic university, ensuring that our teaching and research has a positive impact on local communities. But it doesn't stop there. We have a global impact, and our work in terms of our global recognition has been assessed independently as well as being 99%, for instance, of that research environment as being world leading and internationally excellent. When we look at the world today, there are significant challenges locally and globally across multiple areas. And in 2001, we signed the UN Accord demonstrating our commitment to embed the UN Sustainable Development Goals into every aspect of our activity. Following that in early 2022, and of relevance to today's lecture, Northern Ireland set a target to achieve net zero by 2050 in the Climate Change Bill. I know many people here and many of my colleagues look at envy at what Scotland has been able to do and the ambitions that it has set in being able to deliver net zero much quicker. Of course, as a university, we want to take a lead in the way that we drive net zero and to demonstrate that it is possible. It's not a simple journey, but it is necessary and it is urgent. We are developing a strategy that will enable us to achieve net zero. To make that strategy as ambitious and credible and something that everybody can buy into, we have launched a consultation process with both staff and students and all of our stakeholders in order to be able to deliver it, to identify and gather views, priorities and concerns and ideas for action. We want to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and together we can make that net zero a reality. But before I officially introduce tonight's guest speaker, I would like to thank our established event partners, Engineers Ireland, and in particular John Power, current president, and Gerard McGurr, president of its Northern Ireland region, who are with us tonight. We are also appreciative of the very strong links with the Institution of Engineering and Technology and the support that they have given in delivering this lecture. But I'd now like to say a little something about our guest speaker, Professor Keith Bell. Keith holds the Scottish Power Chair in Future Power Systems at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. He joined that university in 2005, having previously worked as a university researcher and also as a system development engineer with the National Grid in England. He's a member of the Climate Change Committee, co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre, and a highly active member of SIGRI, the International Council on Large Electric Systems. Professor Bell is a chartered engineer and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and has advised Scottish, UK and Irish governments as well as the British energy markets regulator Ofgem on electrical energy systems and power energy issues. We may try and get him in to solve the Brexit protocol in Northern Ireland, given that. But anyway, as a great friend to many here at Queen's, Keith leads the Strathclyde University involvement in the IET Power Academy along with Queen's and 6 other universities. Indeed, we are delighted to recently launch the NI Network's Sustainable Energy Lab, that Power Academy in Queen's, which is used to educate students on how electricity will be the driving force in that transition towards sustainable energy infrastructure and ultimately how it will be part of that core delivery of net zero in the future. It is truly an honour to have you here with us this afternoon, Keith, to give the 21st annual Sir Bernard Crossland Lecture. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome you to the stage to give us your lecture on A Great Wind is Blowing, and that gives you either imagination or a headache, security of supply in a low carbon energy system. So please, welcome.
So, good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak here, in particular to the Chief Executives Club, to Engineers Ireland and the IET. And thank you so much for coming out. I mean, normally coming out on a February evening would be a bit of a bold thing to do, wouldn't it? But it happens to be quite warm this February. We need to do a statistical analysis about why that would be and whether it's just a bit of a chance that this particular evening is quite warm for this time of year. But anyway, that's something we'll no doubt return to. Right, let me see what I'm doing now. So yeah, in case you're wondering about I just found this quote, a great wind is blowing, gives you either imagination or a headache. Apparently Catherine the Great said that. And I don't know anything about Catherine the Great other than I saw her referenced on the web. We trust everything on the web, don't we? Yeah, this is serious. Climate change is real, and it's not just something that's in the future. Whatever we might kind of analyse about the probability of, a day in Belfast in February having a certain kind of average temperature, we can see from things happening around the planet that extreme weather is happening. And it's happening on a regular basis, and it's having huge impacts. So much so that the costs of not doing anything, according to many respected analyses, far outstrip the costs of doing something about it. And there's 2 parts of doing something about it. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions that are causing all of this, and having to adapt to the fact that climate change has already happened and will continue to happen. Even if we stopped emissions today, there's there's a lag built into the system that's going to continue to increase temperatures for some time to come. As engineers, as power engineers, we could look particularly to some of these events, relatively recent on the screen now. So, the sort of lots of bushfires leading to a huge number of system faults in a very short space of time in Australia, between sort of December 2019, January 2020. This last year, drought in China affecting a lot of the hydro reserves, then leading to burning more coal, which just kind of makes the whole problem worse. Serious floods in Pakistan that has still made huge damage to all sorts of infrastructure that's still being recovered from. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the authority on this. Gathered together, leading scientists from around the world. They've been working through steadily the different working groups their sixth assessment report, and okay, here's a lot of words on a slide, so sorry, but I'll highlight some of them. Human-induced climate change is already affecting many climate and weather extremes in every region across the globe. I emerged from, the kind of our COVID lockdown, emerged from the cocoon to kind of return to kind of a big conference. The first time I went to something like that was in November 2021 to COP26, which was in Glasgow, where I live. It's a fantastic opportunity, tremendously exciting, but also a bit nerve-wracking, suddenly being among lots of people doing a lateral flow test every day to get yourself in. And I was lucky enough there to hear a speech by Al Gore, he's given this speech many times, he's very well practiced, does this all over the world. I hope he sorts out his carbon emissions while he's doing it. I just hit us with facts, for an hour. And I was struck by one thing he said, which was, giving all these speeches around the world, he would give an example of climate impact. And he would look for some example from somewhere in the world, from recently. Now, whichever region he is in, he will have an example within the last 2 or 3 months from that very region, just as one illustration of how these sorts of things are happening much more often. Another observation from Working Group 1, limiting human-induced global warming to a specific level requires limiting cumulative CO2 emissions, reaching at least net zero, along with strong reductions in other greenhouse gases, so methane in particular. And we can look at some of this as well in terms of some of the numbers. So here's our global average temperatures relative to what the average was over the period 1850 to 1900. Have temperatures been higher or lower than that average? Yeah, it's pretty clear what we've been seeing in recent decades. So the good news is that governments around the world, lots of governments around the world, and lots of businesses and individuals are taking action about this. And as Professor Rooney said earlier, it includes legislation relatively recent, which I'll come back to, in Northern Ireland. The UK government was advised by the Climate Change Committee, of which I've been a member since April 2019. A great kind of privilege and responsibility to be part of that, but luckily I'm not doing it alone. There's great people in the Secretariat and on the committee. Advised on a net zero greenhouse gas emissions target by 2050 for the UK, and the UK government put that into legislation very quickly. Lots of other governments have come up with net zero commitments as well, including China in 2060, which I think is particularly significant. But it doesn't quite all get there. I mean, depending which assessments you read and how optimistic everybody is about whether the promises will be kept, we may be, 1.5 is sort of just about within reach, maybe. And even at 1.5, we're seeing these sorts of impacts. And the net zero target for the UK is translated into, since 2008 to 2009, when the Climate Change Committee was first established, a number of carbon budgets, and that's something that the new Northern Ireland bill asks for here as well. And the most recent one, the sixth carbon budget, sets a fairly significant reduction relative to the fifth, and also fed into the UK's input to COP26. So it's the first time we've been a party to that agreement since, what was that thing to do with the European Union? Was that anything to, I don't know, I can't remember now. So we had a nationally determined contribution there of a 68% reduction in greenhouse gases relative to 1990 levels. Okay, so how have we been doing? Actually, again, here's good news. This is achievable, and we can say it's achievable because what we have achieved so far, and much of this has been in the electricity sector. So that orange line for the UK, and there's a similar kind of progress with that orange line for Northern Ireland. There are some other sectors that haven't seen much progress or indeed any progress, and so this is a massive challenge. Climate Change Committee believes for the UK this is achievable. It's part of the remit is to advise on the government whether it can be done, how it can be done, to give confidence that it can be done with manageable impacts on the economy, perhaps even positive impacts on the economy as a whole. And that orange wedge, which should be very striking to any of us that are electrical engineers, much of this is down to electrification of the end use of energy and where the energy comes from. And looking a bit more closely at the energy system, so that sixth carbon budget advice set out a number of scenarios depending on what you assume about technological progress, how fast costs come down, societal engagement by individuals, businesses, and so on, willingness to kind of change what we do, whether you might be a bit pessimistic on those things. So looking across the 4 scenarios that were set out, and then picking up, somewhere roughly in the middle, a balanced pathway to then flesh out how can it be done. And in the energy system, this is just one scenario. It's not saying this is not a prescription, but to illustrate what could happen, what can happen, what is deliverable. Here in the energy system for the UK, you can see the massively reduced use of fossil fuels, but also the total energy use reducing. So energy efficiency largely as a reduction, as a function of electrification. So heat pumps, for example, in heating buildings, should be able to get a coefficient of performance of 3. So of course the amount of energy you get out is a lot less than the energy you put in. Electric vehicles more efficient than combustion engine vehicles, this sort of thing. Of course, we also need to do things to make sure when buildings are comfortable, make sure the insulation is adequate and so on. So that of course also brings us energy efficiency. And where is the electricity going to come from? Well, again, there's different possibilities, but renewables being a major part of that. So we're lucky in the natural resources that we have in being so good for wind energy in particular. So, all right, so we can make use of electrification of end use of energy. We can make use of wind in particular to generate that energy, convert it into a usable form. So how is that going to be done? What are the technologies we're actually putting on the system that are going to deliver what we need? I think a particular thing is the kind of increasing ubiquity of power electronics, the devices that are connected. I mean, we're used to electronics at a small scale in terms of devices like this, phones, at a larger scale, power electronic drives for electric trains and motors in manufacturing and so on and so forth. But also on the generation side, so wind turbines being connected either with power electronic devices on the rotor or indeed fully rated on the stator. HVDC, high voltage DC interconnections. So these are tremendously flexible. These offer fantastic opportunities. But I'll come on to it, why we need to maybe think about them also a little bit carefully. And of course, wind energy is a variable resource. So how do we manage everything? Sometimes when maybe the wind is blowing like more than we need for that moment in time, and of course other times when it's not blowing at all. How can we make use of low carbon energy and the complementary sources to sit alongside wind and still meet demand reliably? And how can we keep a power system, that has been described as the largest single machine that humanity has ever built, all these interconnected parts, a non-linear, complex, dynamic system. How do we keep it stable? And do all of that at least cost, especially when we're reminded of how important that is over the last year or so. And we kind of pay attention to it because things do go wrong. So back in 2019, August 2019, the British system on the mainland of GB was affected by a disturbance that led to, within a few seconds, within a minute, 1.1 million customers, end users of electricity, being disconnected. And very quickly, some people who were very skeptical about the benefits of wind energy were jumping on this to say, well, wind energy is to blame. And I kind of thought, well, someone needs to counter this because it's not true. I was able to find out by talking to colleagues in National Grid and just looking at what had happened that this wasn't the case. So it's the first time I'd ever it's my 15 minutes of media fame, stuck my head above the parapet, and got quoted in a few places, including in the Scotsman. The same headline was used in other newspapers. Others said, wind power not to blame for major UK blackout, says Professor. The Scotsman put it slightly differently, which my daughter thought was terribly amusing. But it was important to look in detail at what had happened. So this is a lightning strike, quite a normal thing. It maybe happens to the GB transmission system, I don't know, tens of times a year. The system is designed to be able to cope with that. Protection identifies it, clears the faulted circuit, everything carries on as normal. On this particular occasion, There was a large offshore wind farm just off the Humber coast tripped. It was a wind farm was in the process of being commissioned. A gas-fired combined cycle gas turbine quite near to where the lightning strike hit. That tripped. The first turbine went on some sort of automatic control. I've never actually seen an explanation of why that happened. And then other things, because of that disturbance, lots of small-scale generation on protection settings that everyone knew were not correct but hadn't been changed yet, that also tripped. And the collective impact was more than the kind of, the reserves, the short-term dynamic reserves on the system were designed to contain. And it did lead to triggering of this kind of last resort, right? If you can't increase generation to fill the gap, you've got an imbalance. All you can do to restore the balance is to disconnect demand, and that's what happened. So that low-frequency demand disconnection worked. But one of the reasons why that was kind of interesting is because people have been worried about these converter-connected resources and the fact that they break that electromagnetic coupling between what the rest of the system is doing and what this big bit of steel that's rotating, has got a lot of mass on it, is also doing. So you've got a lot of kinetic energy stored in there. You've got some inertia on the system. So if you're losing that inertia, that kind of acts as a dampener on any of these disturbances on the system. So what are you going to do about that loss of inertia? That's going to mean that things are going to move a lot more maybe than all these other devices are designed to cope with. That gives rise to a need for new kind of ways of managing that. And okay, one of my PhD students, it so happened, looked at that and looked at some of the things you could actuate from, let's say, batteries, for example, and you could do it fast enough to kind of manage the consequences, even with quite a low system inertia. So this gets a lot of attention. I don't know, the system on the island of Ireland might be a different matter. We didn't study that, my PhD student and I, but I think it is manageable, but it needs attention. Okay, there's another thing that the traditional kind of power stations would give you, the kind of electrical machine that you have. When there's a fault, it's a voltage source. So there's a short circuit means that the impedance of that path is lower. The current is going to be much higher. So you can make use of that to say, aha, there's a fault, I better isolate it. So these power electronic devices can't tolerate a very high current. They limit it, otherwise the things just burn out. So the total amount of short circuit current is much reduced. Will our protection devices still work? Can you isolate things safely? And now you're threatening the whole safety of this and security and stability of the system that way. Okay, actually, all these power electronic devices, because there's going to be so many of them, so many wind turbines. Again, another PhD student of mine, Sam Gordon, he looked at this for Scotland, and we think, actually, in 2030, there should be a lot of wind turbines. And they can give you this resource, even when it's not windy. They can act as a voltage source converter, can still give you some current. So actually, it's more subtle than that. It's about the right kind of short circuit current. Whether the specifications of the converters are right to kind of deal with the different sorts of faults that can occur. So there's work to be done there. And it's possible, but it needs attention. We redesign the protection devices, and there's hundreds, thousands of them out on the network. Or do we make sure that these converters, these power electronic things, are specified in a different way? They're so flexible in their controls. You can do almost anything you like. You just got to write the software to do it. Unfortunately, because you can do anything you like, it might end up being things that you don't want. And they interact with each other in an adverse way. And we don't really understand how to manage those interactions for many of these devices working together. This has been a problem in GB, I think more than here. Lots of small scale stuff, great. So, individual wind turbines somewhere, solar PV panels, you have a certain amount of combined heat and power plant. Okay, we shouldn't be building any more waste to power plant, but we've already got quite a lot of it. Stuff connected at distribution level, which for the transmission system operator, certainly in Britain, is just not visible. You can see the net effect of it in changing how much power flows from transmission down into distribution, but you're not quite sure why, or what all these individual things are doing and how they change their dynamics. Remember that August, it's not a Scots professor, it's somebody else thing. A big part of the problem there was these distributed resources where the system operator didn't really know what they were going to do. And certainly the protection on them was not correct. So we've got to understand this properly. They can provide very useful services as well. So it's not just a threat, it's an opportunity. I mentioned already these interactions. So I happened to be in a meeting with some colleagues from Scottish and Southern Energy Networks just yesterday morning, and they talked about weird things happening on the network, which I think sums it up quite well. So here's a weird thing that happened on the GB system back in August 2021. Actually, the plot on the left is from that earlier event I described, where some of the controls on a wind farm were not set correctly. They can be updated very, very fast because it's just a software update. Was it coincidence or otherwise that the wind turbine manufacturer happened to have an update ready to go the next day? Did they already know about this problem? This, I think, has taken this one on the right. It's taken a bit longer to diagnose. Where did this oscillation come from? Quite a big one relative to the voltage on the system. And where did it go? I mean, it disappeared again after 30 seconds. I think it came again briefly about half an hour later. If it had lasted much longer, I understand that some serious problems could have emerged. And the transmission owners and the system operator in Britain have been working quite hard to try and understand why it's happening and what they need to do about it. And there's lots of academic work in this, again, to try and understand it, especially about how we model the system. The complexities of these devices, the detail, our standard models that we've been using for 30 years, 40 years, don't seem to be adequate. So yeah, let's try and sort this out quickly. Okay, here's something that I think we'll come back to the ambition on the island of Ireland as well as in GB. I'll just kind of explain this plot a little bit. So yes, there are times when, by the time you've got a lot of wind farms and you maybe have added in a lot of solar PV, when the wind and sun conditions are so favourable, at that moment in time you've got a lot more power available than you need, than the country needs, bigger than the demand. But of course there'll be other times when it's not windy and sunny and that demand isn't met. So I'll just use this as sort of talking about the residual demand, the difference between the demand and what's available from these variable renewables. And this is another one of my PhD students. I've been doing great help in this. So Sinead, she's actually taken from a European model, and we just extracted things within that model, Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland. So it's a scenario for 2030, so don't read too much into it. Some of the data is a bit old, but just for illustrative purposes, let's look at the residual demand and how it is in the island and for Northern Ireland. And you can see that the extremes. So we've got quite a big gap to fill when it's not windy and sunny, but also, if you look at that orange line, for example, quite a number of hours, maybe in that case about a quarter of the year when there's a surplus. So what are we going to do with that surplus? Well, we could export it if someone will have it. And this model did have an interconnected European kind of system. Again, you've got to make assumptions about the interconnected capacities. Maybe some flexible demand can make use of it. So what time are you going to charge your electric vehicle? Can you kind of warm up a building using your heat pump and kind of maybe let the temperature get a bit higher and then switch it off again when you don't need it and use that inherent storage capacity in a building, for example. But otherwise, you spill some of that energy. Now, I think there's already about 15% per annum of a proportion of the available wind energy is being kind of curtailed at the moment, I understand, in Northern Ireland. And that's because the interconnected capacity isn't big enough to send it to someone who could use it in those hours. So based on the assumptions that something is going to be built in terms of network capacity, actually the spilled energy is not too bad here. Maybe the economic optimum is not zero, probably. So okay, that doesn't look so bad. But you can see the level of interaction across the interconnectors on the charts on the right. So quite a lot of time importing, but quite a bit of the time exporting as well. You can see certainly for the island of Ireland, you're reaching the kind of saturation on the interconnector capacity, which suggests a need for perhaps more. But we also need to look, so those I've just taken all those numbers, individual hours, residual demand, and interconnected transfers, and stacked them from the smallest on the right to the biggest on the left. I've lost the connection in time, the fact that 1 hour follows another. So here, I've just extracted some particular days from that year-round simulation. And on the left, there's a day when it's just not very windy all day. And on the right, it is windy all day. So you've got a surplus or a deficit. So how do we fill in that gap? So actually, flexible demand, switching on or off your electric vehicle, well, at some point your battery will be full and you can't do any more. You can't soak up any more of that surplus on the right. On the other hand, on the left, okay, you might have vehicle to grid and discharge your battery. Now you might have discharged it. Where else are you going to get that energy from? We've made use of stored energy all the time. Piles of coal or caverns full of natural gas. It's not a two-way process, but we can make use of that storage. Either we've got to capture the CO2 emissions if we're going to continue to make use of those reserves, or we've got to do something else. So one option, I think a very interesting option, is we use the surplus to manufacture hydrogen. We store the hydrogen. You can store it somewhere kind of dirty, like a salt cavern. Take it out again. Okay, you use it for different purposes. Actually, it's quite flexible in what you do. Some purposes you've got to clean it up, but otherwise you could very crudely burn it when you need this extra electricity generation. So the round trip efficiency is not very good, all these kind of conversion process and extraction. But how else are you going to move all that energy from 1 hour to another hour in another season? The other competing technologies, they've also got challenges in terms of round trip efficiency and the total cost. And I love this word, Dunkelflaute. Who's heard of that before? A few people. Yeah, it's good, isn't it? So I think in the German literally means dark doldrums. So you're not getting a lot of energy from solar PV, and in being in the doldrums, it's not very windy either. And it could last for some days. So that you've got to set the scale right. How much energy storage capacity do we need? So, all right, we've got all these different resources. We've got these possible things we could do. We could flex the demand. We could use interconnectors. We've got sources of wind power. In GB, we've got nuclear power stations, slowly building a new one. You could use a combined cycle gas turbine, to kind of make heat, to make steam. But we can't allow unabated use of natural gas anymore. We've got to either capture the CO2 or use hydrogen manufactured from blue sources, which means you've steam methane reformation, and you've captured as much of the CO2 as you can, which is not all of it. Or if you've got low carbon electricity, you can then use that in electrolysis to make hydrogen. That's green hydrogen. As I say, quite crudely, you could then turn that back into electricity. So you need these things to be flexible because the residual demand moves around all the time as we switch things on and off, as the wind speeds increase or decrease. You need things to be what I call schedulable. It means you've got to be able to depend on it and plan its output some days in advance, especially around these Dunkelflaute cases or days when it's kind of residual demand is coming up and down. To schedule something, which you can't really do with wind and solar. Because you're not completely confident some days out or weeks out how windy or sunny it's going to be when the clouds are going to come over or whatever. And you need enough energy. Once you've got it on, is it going to stay on and continue to generate? So in other words, it's got to be persistent. And you can see looking through that table, none of these resources is a perfect combination, which means we've got to have a combination of all these different resources. We can't rely on any one thing. There's no silver bullet. We've got to get a number of bullets of different colors. And I've touched on this already. These resources will be in particular places that people will allow you to build, and you've got to move that power from one place to another to where it's being used. We need enough network capacity. We've got a real challenge where I'm coming from in Scotland. Of, lots of interest. If you've ever been to Scotland, have you noticed it's a windy place? We've got to try and export that to where the big demand centres are down south. And that network is quite long, and it's not got a huge amount of capacity. And then there's great excitement at the recent leasing round, the rights to develop new wind farms offshore on the Scottish seabed. A huge amount, 25 gigawatts of interest in that auction, which would massively increase, even if only a proportion of it was built under windy conditions, massively exceed the existing network capacity. So, and because it's so difficult to get permission to build overhead lines, I know you know that here, I was involved in one of the many reviews of the North-South Interconnector a few years ago. We've ended up in Britain going offshore and building HVDC links in parallel with the main system. So, these get you a certain amount of capacity each one, but not all that amount relative to the total needs. We've got to build many of them. And then you start to get into challenges about the supply chain. You know, what's the cable manufacturing capacity? What's the converter manufacturing capacity? How do all these things, now you've got yet more power electronics controlling things. How are you specifying how they behave? And we could go further offshore and think, okay, well actually there's an opportunity here. We can build some of these connections, not just to get the power back from an offshore wind farm, but to interconnect with another country. What's the right sort of design? And lots of interesting ideas, I think, have been coming out over the last few years from the Netherlands and from Denmark about, you know, maybe an artificial island on Dogger Bank. You can put a substation on there, you can put converter stations, you can have a hotel for maintenance staff and a runway so they can access it safely. You know, all sounds quite exciting. You know, they're serious about it. They talk to the people who build all these artificial islands in Dubai, for example. Yeah, we can do that. Or big platforms like, you know, like the oil platforms or whatever. So, you know, it's possible. We've got to start to think big because the climate change challenge is big. So engineers in the room would have noticed some things I've not talked about. In particular, system strength. So who likes talking about system strength? Any shows of hands? Who's heard of that? What does that mean? So a lot of us power engineers have talked about what we want is a strong system. So when we connect new things to it, it's all going to be stable. What do we mean by that? And actually, when you talk in detail, it means different things to different people or different combinations of things. And because it means different combinations, there are different ways you could deliver those services. So in Britain, we're putting in old-style synchronous generators on the system. It helps, but is it the most cost-effective way of doing it? I'm not totally sure that it is. The existing wind farms can do a lot for you in many respects. If only we could work out, you know, the availability and kind of build up, especially build up confidence in the system operator, the people in the control room who've got to actually make the decision about using it or not. And I've talked about all these very flexible power electronic converters. We could do things with them. So I think we should stop talking about system strength actually and get more into the nuances. Now, all of that is about, you know, surviving disturbances, and it's within this sort of framework, I think, of resilience, which again is a term that has always been around. We've always talked about it, but it's been coming back, I think, rightly, both in climate change discussions and in power engineering discussions. In a power engineering context, it means these sort of three things. That we need to prevent interruptions to the supply of power. And because we can't completely guarantee there will never be an interruption, when things happen, we want to contain them. They don't affect so many people and they don't last too long. And worst case, well, we have to recover from it, reconnect people safely. Worst case, the whole system could go down, and that happens. Has happened, normally happens for a whole country or a large region 2 or 3 times a year, every year, somewhere in the world. So brings us back, I think, to those 6 things I was laying out. Is there enough generation to meet the demand? How flexible is it? Have we got enough network capacity to access it? And how do we design all the controls to make sure they respond in the right ways and interact with each other properly? But it's also a societal question, back to what people are doing with electricity. As we decarbonize our end uses, for example, in heating and transport, we become even more dependent on it. We're dependent on it for communication and light and so many things already. So the resilience of the system becomes ever more important. And we've really got to get a handle on this. And it's not just these kind of everyday disturbances like, you know, lightning strikes or whatever, or, you know, the equipment faults. It's also the extreme disturbances, like those ones I talked about at the beginning. You know, these bushfires in Australia, or we had a few storms coming across. There's one from November 2021, which disconnected people in the Highlands sometimes for 2 weeks, where they're depending on electricity for their heating in very low temperatures. So these might be rare, they are rare, might be becoming more frequent. Okay, actually the evidence in terms of storms in the British Isles is a bit mixed, so I understand it from the climate scientists, even if it's very unambiguous for other parts of the world. They might be quite rare, but we've got to be prepared. And it's not just about the kind of natural disturbances, it's also things within the engineering system. So, you know, there was some type faults on French nuclear plant that took a large part of their fleet out last year. And we're aware of kind of impacts on the gas system, single points of failure affecting the whole of Europe. We've got to be kind of ready for this, and it's difficult to kind of compute what is a good decision to make. But if there's one lesson to me anyway from the pandemic, is that these rare things do happen, and we've got to make sure we're properly prepared. We don't just tell ourselves that we're prepared, we've really got to test it out. Okay, so my 6 challenges. Apologies to fans of Italian literature for me kind of mangling the name of this play by Pirandello and talking, instead of 6 characters in search of an author, 6 challenges in search of some order in respect of the power system. So how can we make full use of the low carbon electricity when it's available and still meet the demand when it's not windy? But there are, opportunities here. The cost of renewables has come down amazingly over the last sort of 10 years or so. Less than half of what it used to be in terms of unit costs of energy production. Similar for solar PV, similar for lithium-ion batteries. It does also have some risks, not just the kind of engineering uncertainties I've talked about, but also in terms of commodities. Where does the lithium come from? Where does the cobalt come from? Those sorts of things. And to understand it, and as engineers to inform policymakers in particular, we depend on models. And at this point, I feel kind of statutorily obliged to mention George Box and his quote of, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So it's always an approximation of reality. And we've got to make sure we do that kind of in a serious way and understand the detail of what's really inside the box. And we need some specialists to do that and also to be clear, people, users of models, what they're using it for and what sorts of decisions can be made on the basis of them. And it needs expertise to use them. And I've already touched on this, it's more than just engineering. It's about serving the needs of society. Technology is just an enabler. And its use depends on choices made by people and people's choices influenced by institutions, market arrangements, actually also regulation, building standards, for example. And a lot of the stuff I've talked about, the progress in reducing emissions, has been on the supply side, changing the nature of electricity generation. And okay, to begin with, when wind farms are more expensive than they are now, it did mean an extra bit on our bills. But, okay, depending where you live, you might have them dotted in the landscape, you might not be a fan of that, you might not like some of the noise that comes with it. But aside from that, most people really haven't noticed. The supply of electricity is as reliable as it was before. But now we have the challenge of action on the demand side, how we use energy. And we are all going to notice when we are encouraged via market signals or whatever to abandon our combustion engine vehicles or to change our heating systems at home. And the price rises in the wholesale gas markets in particular have reminded us, I think, of the trilemma, which we used to talk about a lot and then kind of went out of fashion. And it's come back. We always assumed they were in tension. These elements of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, ensuring reliable supplies of energy, and making sure that things are affordable. And we thought we couldn't achieve all of those. But the reduction in the cost of renewables means that now reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and affordability are pulling in the same direction, leaving, which is partly why I've kind of emphasized it, the reliability of supply bit. But it's not the only set of considerations. What's the impact on the natural environment, flora and fauna? Will it be acceptable? Not everybody likes a wind turbine, not everybody likes overhead lines. What's the impact on the wider economy? What's the kind of distributional effect of whatever investment we're making? Because it is an investment which brings opportunities, but maybe some costs to some other people. How do we design policies and markets to fairly attribute all of those costs and benefits? And an example of that, bills in the recent history have gone up a lot. Was it the right policy to effectively subsidize retail bills? Could we have intervened in some other way to reform the wholesale market such that those costs were not always fed through? The cost of energy from wind has remained low, even though the cost of gas has increased. But gas is setting, is the marginal unit, that's setting the price of energy in the market. So how do we kind of reform all of that? And that depends on, eventually, policy. Politicians informed by civil servants, informed by engineers, This is a great book. I don't know if anyone's already read it. I read it a few years ago. I recommend it, especially to all civil servants. And they studied lots of case studies of blunders made by the UK government, things like the poll tax and the liberalisation of pensions and privatisation of the London Underground and all the ways in which it went wrong. And there's two quotes that stood out for me from their conclusions about, it's not just enough to sort of say, well, this is what I want. You've also got to work out how. How are you going to get there? And that is a real challenge. It's a challenge, for example, that the Climate Change Committee has presented to the Scottish Government and the UK Government in the annual progress reports. It said, okay, there's lots of good aspiration, lots of good targets. How are you going to meet them? I think I'll move on from that one. So we have to kind of continually monitor what's happening, report on it, because not every policy, even if you have defined the how, it's not always effective, as we've realized. So to keep an eye on that and say, okay, well, how do we change it? So there's feedback loops that us engineers are very accustomed to. And we can't guarantee how things will turn out because, the world is complex. Okay, here's how complex. So this is just one example of things interacting and influencing the decarbonisation of energy in homes. And this is from a publication from the Royal Academy of Engineering, advocating a systems perspective. You'll hear lots of people talking about this now, quite rightly, I think, or having a whole system approach. So what does that mean, or systems thinking? What does that mean in practice? How is it possible for anyone to hold all of that stuff and all of those interactions in their head at any one time? I think the key to that is recognizing the links, and it's not just the engineering technical factors, it's also the economic and social influences. It's a socio-techno-economic system, not just a technical system, and between different energy vectors, not just electricity, but gas, hydrogen, heat, hot water, whatever. And to make sense of all those complexities, defining what the boundaries are between them, how they interact with each other. And we've got a hope of breaking it down to the individual pieces, but also know how it's transferring and influences are moving across the boundary with the next piece. Then we can kind of zoom out to maybe a simpler understanding of it, see how they all fit around, and then zoom back in again to the detail. So that includes having people who can understand the big picture and the specialists who understand the detail in any one of these pieces. But also, we've got to come up with a decision at the end and some action. So it needs a bit of trust in someone to make sense of that bigger picture and make a decision and move forward. Okay, I'm wrapping up now. Positive note, it can be done. This is a major message from, including people like the International Energy Agency, who are often quite skeptical, Climate Change Committee, the Energy Transition Commission, which is another body exists in the UK, has noted progress already being made. So they said, well, we need 50 low-carbon steel plants for the 1.5 degree pathway in 2030. 45 of them, I didn't know this until I read this, 45 of them already in development, getting towards final investment decisions. The International Energy Agency thinks the world will have reached peak fossil fuel use, partly influenced by what's happening in Ukraine and the willingness now, extra imperative to wean ourselves off Russian gas, by 2025. We've got new commitments to emissions reduction in the US and Australia. There's been a change of government in Brazil, which gives us some hope both about the rainforest and about their use of energy and agriculture and so on. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US, massively positive, but also actually it's also a threat. Is that going to attract investment away from Europe into the US? We'll have to see how that comes. But leadership, I think, is really key to this. I don't need to talk to this audience in this country about the need for strong leadership to drive us in the right sort of direction. And all of us have a part to play in that. And I want to finish on this for engineers. I do get a bit annoyed when I hear on the radio or the TV people talking about the creative industries. I mean, they mean the arts, so it's great. I love some music and literature like anybody else, but us engineers, we're creative people. It depends on it to come up with the ideas of how we're going to solve these problems, or what might explain something that we're seeing. So it needs creativity. It also needs a certain amount of persistence, because it doesn't always work first time. And it needs all of us in this room. Thank you very much. positive message on the screen there, just for kind of, remind us.
So I'm not sure who you've annoyed, but you're stuck with me now for the next 15 minutes. Yes, folks, just to introduce myself quickly. I'm Brian Muirhead. I'm a former IET Power Academy scholar, and I'll just be hosting the Q&A here with Keith. So we'll open up to questions around the room in just a second, but as part of my deal for doing this, I sort of shotgunned the first question.
So should you start off with an easy one or a difficult one?
Yeah, no, we'll do an easy one. But yeah, just a personal thanks for myself. I know you're one of the kind of founding members of the Power Academy scheme. I'm not long off it myself, so I sort of owe you a thanks, and I'll always be eternally grateful to my sponsor company and NIE Networks as well. A great scheme. I know there's probably a lot of talented young engineers in the audience tonight that have come through Queen's and the Power Academy Scholarship Scheme. So just on that theme, the energy revolution that we're going through is a massive challenge. It's going to take a lot of talented engineers. We're going to really need to bring through the next generation. And it's something sort of close to my heart. We're bringing in our second wave of graduates in work at the minute as well. And I know certainly education and skills is something close to your heart as well. So yeah, my first question is really, what do we as industry, as engineers and at a government level need to be doing strategically to bring forward the skills to deliver this revolution?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I've been talking to people, not just in Britain, but other parts of Europe as well over the last little while, about what we see as being some of the biggest challenges in delivering this energy transition. And one that always comes up is about skills and the need for people, enough people to deliver all of this. And it's in multiple roles. So, technicians, fitters, even lawyers and financial people, professional engineers, across the board. So it's not just, people with a chartered kind of status and whatever. So how do we get enough people? We're already in the industry, I'm sure lots of people here will know this. It's very hard to find people who fill a vacancy. There's a lot of churn going on. People basically kind of pinching from each other or relying on basically imports of people. So we're pinching from other places. Great to offer opportunities, that's great, but what happens to the places they've left behind? Where's that talent gone? In respect of Europe, it's more difficult now than it was. So I think we should be investing, looking to the longer term. It's always easy to say we should look to the long term, and it somehow never happens. But this is imperative for all these reasons I've tried to explain here about climate change and making everything work. We've got to be investing in skills and talent for the longer term. It means growing our own, pretty much, which starts at a school level, I think. Yep. And works through to FE colleges, always underappreciated, I think, and higher education establishments. And government has a role, of course, in providing a lot of the kind of foundation funding, base funding for the colleges and the universities, schools, of course, but also industry. I think it's got to do more, not just be looking for the next financial year and how many grads you want to take on, but a program of grads you want to take on over the next 5 years, 10 years, and working back and say, where are they coming from? Some of them are now going through early stages of secondary school. If we want them to be a graduate, we've got to encourage them into the sector now. And we should have enough confidence. If we can trust the politicians to say, we are going to deliver on emissions reduction, we are going to keep 1.5 alive, then investment will have confidence, and then maybe we get a chance of long-term investment in people.
Now remember, you just said, if we can trust the politicians. We are in Northern Ireland here tonight.
Sorry, I'm from the government.
No, that's probably unfair if there is any politicians in the room. No, I think that was a great answer, and I think something we've been kind of trying to pioneer as well is, you've grad intakes. A lot of modern apprenticeships are great ways to bring kids in out of school, study their career or degrees while they're working as well. If people just want to raise their hand in the audience, if we have any questions for Keith, then yes, we have a gentleman over here.
There's a microphone arriving, it looks like.
Yeah, if you just want to stand up and introduce yourself just briefly.
Thanks very much. My name is Neil McCann. I'm very touched by your wonderful talk, and at least in the academic side, because I've heard it to some degree in the artistic world. The expression of joined-up thinking is just, Wow, it's lovely. There were two things I wanted to ask you about. One, you alluded to some degree, and that's the whole question of money and how money cost, the management of money, investment, how you intervene with markets, intervene at the wholesale end of the distribution of electricity rather than the retail. All of those brilliant questions, and you have leaned into that. The other is the question of global security, that how we will find a way that the nations can look to the future and know that there will be peace between nations as well as between individuals and groups of people within nations. I personally found the Ukraine experience completely caught me on the hop, and most people that I know it did as well. But we've known that the United Nations itself, in its present formation, isn't sufficient, and that ways must be found for folk, to use a good Ulster expression, for folk to get on and to know that we can get on, and that will be the outlook for the children. So just those two wee things there.
Just a couple of small questions there, yeah.
The dosh and the dosh and the safety is what teenagers want loads of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, it does go kind of beyond my kind of, let's say, training and experience as an engineer. As I've pointed out, I've started to work in sort of policy circles a bit, but I'm still with a limited kind of remit. But then all of us have got an equal right to comment on this as citizens. So I'll make use of my right on that basis. So it seems to me that kind of a big part of the kind of European economic model since the Second World War has been that we're much less likely to fight with each other if we're trading with each other. And that seems to be, especially in Germany, which was regarded as controversial elsewhere in Europe, to trade with Russia. So it breaks down when one of those parties just says, well, actually, no, I don't care, for whatever reason. So you then kind of fall back upon, maybe this word resilience is kind of important there, that what are the risks associated with that, and things like your supply chains are resilient in spite of disruptions. It's really hard to kind of put a value on that, because you don't know what the probability is of it happening. You hope it will happen rarely, but it is worth paying the option price to kind of have that backstop capability when we're building up kind of some domestic industries, or you have diversity of contracts. Let's say with lithium-ion batteries, a diversity of materials. So I know there's lots of electrochemists and material scientists working really hard on that. And the other, what was the quote from Winston Churchill that I will misquote? Democracy is the worst idea anyone ever thought of apart from all the alternatives, or something. What was it? And the UN kind of at this global scale for managing climate change is kind of the best, seems to me, and I know to lots of people I work with in the CCC, the best option there is. So we have to sort of carry on. We have to persist with it. The COPs, the Conference of the Parties, might seem like a bit of a circus in some ways, a bit of a jamboree, loads of people turn up, traveling the world. There's lots of stuff that goes on in between, lots of diplomacy to get some of the protocols and agreements and working groups together. But it is important to get the global leaders together and to actually sort of try and bang their heads together and say, this is serious, we really need to get somewhere. And because it's impacting on every country, pretty much, no global leader should really be able to ignore it, not for very long. Okay, we depend on electoral cycles and whatever, but let's take China. It's an authoritarian regime, but massive problems with urban pollution. If they're going to sustain their economic growth, they need sustainable sources of energy. So, they have got new policies. They've still got the coal-fired power stations and so on, but they've been building and using loads of wind turbines as well. So there is some potential. We've got no alternative, basically, to trying to keep talking. And I suppose that's another kind of thing, I guess I know you know about in Ulster as well, in Northern Ireland, carry on with. What was the other question? Yeah, markets. And so even if there's centralised decision-making about what is that right combination of resources, there's still a role, I think, for the private sector to deliver, to build, do the detailed design. Maybe if you want to go that way, to borrow the money. So there might be some kind of central design authority rather than just leaving it exactly what the mix is to emerge from the market. In my own mind, I tend to lean that way about some central hand on it, even if it might not be perfect, but let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, I would say as well, because we've just got to get on with it. It's the pace of this as well as the scale suggests we haven't got time to hang around and come up with the perfect set of market mechanisms.
I just add on the kind of the economic point as well. Some of the markets are working. I think there's 340 gigawatts of renewable generation in the queue to connect in GB at the minute.
Although somebody might argue that's the market not working.
Well,
because if the market was working, the only things in the queue would be realistic ones. Otherwise, they're kind of sterilising the connections for everybody else. So
it is.
But it appears to be not a shortage of money.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's. But there does need to be probably a bit more of that central control. Is probably where it's at. This gentleman over here.
Hi, Andy Frew in the Housing Executive. Certainly for housing, I think the differences between demand is much bigger for heat than for power. And it makes us think that perhaps should we be storing power like some people do from summer to winter. But if the wind energy is getting cheaper and cheaper, perhaps the losses from stored heat reduce, or the value of those losses are less relevant. So should we be doing more with thermal storage?
I mean, thermal storage is, as you'll know better than me, cheap, isn't it? A hot water tank that's well lagged. We can try and if we've got a lack of space, the phase change materials seem really promising. Maybe they'll come down in cost as we learn how to manufacture them in a better way or something. So of course they are leaky. Even with something well insulated. So seasonal storage, I know there's a couple of colleagues have looked at that, putting, enormous kind of concrete foundations and putting heat in, or disused mine workings, put some heat down in there. So, there are some losses. But as you say, if the surplus energy is cheap, why not? Let's just use as much of it as we can. So it is definitely part of the mix, I would say. I'm not clear in my own mind what's the right combination or what's absolutely the right solution. But the simple answer to your question, I think, thermal storage has got to be in there, and it's got to be a very useful tool, definitely on the kind of within day scale, and as you suggest, on longer scales potentially as well.
Thanks. And yes, this gentleman over here.
Hi, thanks for the very stimulating discussion and talk. I'm David Timoney from University College Dublin. I just retired from same, but about 15 years ago I created a master's degree program in energy systems engineering, began to realise just how many aspects to it there are. I began to conclude that life cycle assessment, looking at the total picture, is absolutely essential to know whether you've really improved something or whether you just shifted the problem to somewhere else, moving, steel making abroad and so on. Do you think there is enough emphasis on the full life cycle assessment process in terms of determining whether any initiative has really improved the world or just moved the problem to somebody else's lap?
That's an extremely good question, and I would agree with you. There's not enough attention. Charts I didn't show, for example, were about consumption emissions rather than what I showed was territorial emissions. So just directly what's happening within a certain territory, the UK or Northern Ireland or whatever. What about all the goods and services that we import? And what are the emissions associated with those? Much harder to work out what they really are because you don't have all the data. All the embodied emissions, in kind of manufacturing those things, including the things here. And then the disposal as well. What happens to the materials at the end? So, there's talk about the circular economy, quite rightly, but I'm not expert enough on it to know what are the best ways of making sure it really happens. And we've just got too used to kind of a throw it away and replace it type of society. It really annoyed me talking to my daughter the other day when she said, the charger has given up or whatever. No, the port on her iPad has given up the ghost. It's been glued on apparently or soldered on, and no one was able to repair it. Her local little shop that would normally do things really cheaply couldn't do it. Went to the Apple store, who said it will cost you 280 quid. She's going, well, a new one would be 340. So I might as well do that. So, why are things not designed to be repairable? And so we might hope that the market value would emerge and the product designers would I can get an advantage over a competitor by making it that way. That hasn't happened. So I tend to think there is a role for regulation in that sort of thing, obliging, repairability, and then start to create a market for some of the materials, for example, as well. We're going to have to get good at recycling the lithium out of batteries at some point. Again, there isn't quite a market for it there yet. But yeah, I think I tend to agree. I think there is value. The life cycle emissions, lots of analyses that I've seen suggest, yes, we are making a difference. Is it as much of a difference as it could be or should be? No, I agree. We should be paying more attention.
Thanks, great question. And yes, the gentleman here with the purple tie, just. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. Really appreciated it. The NIEN capacity map has lots of little red dots with zero headroom, as you probably know. In those areas, for instance, coming from Cookstown up as far as Strabane and to the left of that, South Armagh, right round the north coast, etc. If they have zero headroom there, how do you see that impacting on electric vehicle rollout and the likes of fast chargers, etc.?
Well, clearly, if the electric vehicle hasn't got a charge, it's not going to roll out. It's not going to roll anywhere unless you just take the handbrake off on a hill. But it depends what the combination is. So some parts of the network, and I'm sure it's be true, in and around here, it's the export capacity that's been reached. So you've just got a lot of wind farm developed, and under windy conditions, you can't get it all out. You've got to curtail. Well, there's an opportunity for end use of electricity. So, there's, okay, look a bit further afield, but I gather around about Dublin, there are big challenges with data centres wanting to build around there in an area that's already an importing zone. So how can you encourage them to go and locate next door to where there's a surplus and where there's an export constraint? And similarly, you want to encourage, if you can, generation resources to be where there's an import constraint. But yes, when you get down to the low voltage network, especially, or the medium voltage network, that's not always an option. There's a certain amount we can do by kind of looking at the peak loads, so what we can shave off. Half-hourly metering then becomes important to encourage that. And we've already said earlier, that especially when we have a lot of heat demand becoming electrified, those peaks become very, very big. There's not a lot you can do with heat relative to EVs. EVs, there should be a lot of flexibility. You can do it overnight or whenever it's windy. If it's plugged in, and I think, I saw some numbers that another one of my students dug out a little while ago, that your average car is parked for 95% of the time. Right, so it's plugged in, okay, then you've got access to a charging point. That's another whole big story. But if it's plugged in, then you've got a lot of flexibility in when you do the charging. You don't have to be charging all of that time. So you can match that to the availability and the network capacity as well. And we could be discharging as well. That's another kind of thing that can help depending on the circumstances. Heat is a bit harder, both because it's a bigger peak and there's less independence, there's less diversity. We're all cold at the same time. But you can get a bit if you've got a well-insulated building and you've got thermal storage like we were talked about earlier. But in the end, we probably just need to kind of end up face the fact. I'm sorry, any regulators in the room that think this is all going to be cheap. Build more network, I think. Okay, you can smarter about real-time thermal ratings and stuff like that. But yeah, you get to a certain point, you've just got to build more network. And then the challenge is, right, well, there's a phrase I've heard, Ofgem in Britain using, touch the network once. So looking far enough ahead and making that sort of strategic decision, having confidence in that decision, say, okay, we'll dig up the streets and we'll replace the cable. We'll size that cable. Once you know you've reached a tipping point, you've got to dig up the street. That's a large part of the cost of the project is the civil engineering works. The kind of incremental cost of putting in, a much higher rated cable is small relative to the total cost of the project. So just do it. If you're digging it up, replacing it, put in as much capacity as you can in that one go. Don't try and fine tune it, just do it.
Thanks very much. Just a quick add-on to that, if I can. In terms of, you talked about trying to move demand closer to the renewable sources of generation. I think nodal pricing seems to be one of the big buzzwords as part of REMA, the big consultation going on market arrangements in GB at the minute.
Yeah.
Just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked me that. As it happens, so REMA, Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, UK government, I don't know if this week if it's called BEIS or DESNES
they're changing names every other day.
DESNS or what. Anyway, we know what we mean, the UK government. That's one of the options, so nodal pricing or locational marginal pricing. It's as you'll know, it's a very controversial subject because there will be winners and losers. So if you're an energy user and you're in an export constrained area and there's lots of good cheap local resources, you should get a low local price. If you're the generator in that place, you're a loser because now your revenues are cut dramatically, and you don't know if you're going to get access to the network in the first place. You get dispatched. But another part of it is a lot of people talk about is uncertainty. So as a colleague I did a bit of work with last year, I thought came up with a brilliant kind of phrase. If I can't model it, I can't invest against it. And it's very difficult to model what these nodal prices will be, even tomorrow, let alone in 10 years' time. So there's that uncertainty, it's argued, leads to a much higher cost of capital, which in the end perhaps outstrips all the savings you might get from putting all these things in different places. Then you've got to say, well, how much flexibility is there to move this stuff around? Wind farm developments especially, you need to get the land, you need to have the right, kind of wind speeds and so on. So partly why I'm glad you asked is, so happens that 2 weeks ago, along with a couple of colleagues, we wrote a report about locational marginal pricing. Kind of not top of the bestseller chart, I'm afraid, but it is available for free online, all 140 pages of it, so you've got to be really keen. There is also an executive summary and a blog that you can find on the web. But it's an ongoing debate. We didn't come up with any answers, by the way. We just said, be careful. There's a lot of the debate that I've seen in Britain is very kind of superficial. And there's a lot of design detail that you've got to get right. So we've done a bit of work looking in the US and other places to sort of unpack that and say, okay, it's got potential advantages, but you've got to design it in the right way to complement other things that you might be doing. For example, contracts for difference with renewables or whatever.
Yeah. Don't underestimate how much of a nerd I am for electricity, so I'll be looking that up.
Right.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I think Alan here in the front was maybe first hand up.
Alan Watts, and that name alone makes me the best named member of this audience tonight. Keith, I know that you're not an expert on the Northern Ireland energy system, and yet your excellent talk made it clear that you know an awful lot about it. So my question for you, slightly tongue-in-cheek, is if you were the Northern Ireland Energy Minister, if we had such a thing as a Northern Ireland Energy Minister, or indeed any other minister, for one day, what changes would you make? I'm going to guess more interconnectivity and more storage, but what would you do? And good luck to you.
I'm glad you've postulated this almost mythical scenario of there actually being a Northern Ireland Energy Minister. And then I'm very grateful you suggested some possible answers to throw into that mythical scenario. But more interconnector capacity, that definitely would go ahead. I'm sorry if that overhead line is not, your favourite view, but I think it's extremely important to get that away. And my understanding is, the planning permission has been approved. I think that, some of the detail is now being worked up to deliver it. I think that's really positive. It's kind of the interseasonal storage. I think there are market mechanisms already driving, should be driving short-term storage. Half-hourly metering and kind of turns that at a domestic scale would help an awful lot. I didn't finish that point off from earlier about flexibility. I see big challenges in the interseasonal storage and what would be the kind of market mechanisms or the investment mechanisms to get that done. Because, you can make money out of a battery every time you cycle it, every time you charge it and discharge it, you're earning money. You're buying the energy when it's cheap and selling it when it's expensive. So do that as many times as possible. But these reserves for Dunkelflaute, you're holding there for, a year, 10 years, they're kind of at the margins. You're not able to earn on the energy itself. So you've got to somehow have the very large capital cost recovered. But the other thing would be looking into the demand side. To see there's such a challenge, we've got to understand the nature of that challenge much more precisely about the nature of potential disruption, really what the costs are of large-scale electrification of heat, the potential benefits of hybrid heat sources. There's still some benefits you get from molecules. Gives you that sort of flexibility, might mean you don't have to dig up quite so many roads of the electricity network, for example. So I'd want to get a much more precise understanding on that. I'd be commissioning detailed analytical work on that as well.
Thanks for the question, Alan. I'm getting the time signal here, folks, so apologies. We probably could go on all night.
You thought I was going to go on all night, but I was kind of giving so many slides.
But yeah, thanks for that. Was a real technical masterclass. And well, Alan just said he thought he had the best name in the house tonight, but I'm going to introduce somebody with an even more apt name coming after me here. Is the Engineers Ireland President, John Parr.
Thank you very much, Brian. Ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a great pleasure for me as President of the Institution of Engineers of Ireland, or Engineers Ireland as we're known, to be proposing the vote of thanks this evening. Very often people in my position kind of act as a sweeper at the end of the evening following the talk. But I'd have to say that having listened to Keith and the Q&A afterwards, there's very little sweeping to be done. Just maybe a few closing remarks, if I may, and certainly my take from the evening. It's a wonderful time to be an engineer. Can you imagine graduating from college as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old now, and being faced with the challenges that are going to make such a difference for mankind over the next number of years? What a great time to be facing that. My take would be certainly that the two biggest, or among the two biggest challenges we have, are going to be energy and climate change. And when one considers, they're both related quite clearly. The energy availability, accessibility and affordability is a problem almost everywhere in the world at the moment. But there are solutions, and I think the screen behind me says an awful lot here. Those solutions are going to be implemented and developed, further ones that need to be, by engineers, because if we don't do it, nobody else will. So really there's a big weight on our shoulders, I believe, but at the same time, there's nobody else can carry that load better than we can. So I would sincerely hope that the young engineers of today will certainly embrace that challenge and deliver, as I have every confidence that they will. So, you know, there are two areas that I think clearly we can, those of us who are in the engineering field, play a very, very big part into the future. I think the book that Keith mentioned, The Blunders of Our Governments, I'm quite sure that book could be written about every government in the world. And the one thing that I took from it was, I suppose, that the requirement for the expertise, well, we have that expertise. The one thing we're regularly lacking is decision making. And the delays, the unnecessary delays, the posturing, et cetera, that cause so many further problems by virtue of us not getting things done. So I think that you know, one of the final comments of Keith's talk was about the socio-technical economic system. It is that. We've got to collaborate, we've got to work together, we've got to communicate better, but there are solutions out there, and it's up to us engineers, as I say, to deliver on those solutions. On that note, I'm going to finish this part of it, and just to say thanks, a particular word of thanks to Keith for a fantastic talk for any engineer, but maybe more particularly for those of us who were fortunate enough to do electrical engineering. To Brian and David for their contribution this evening, but particularly to the audience here for the Q&A, for your participation, to the people who made this evening possible. There's a lot of people, I won't mention anybody in particular because I'm going to leave somebody out, but to everybody who contributed to that, thanks very much. But in particular, I'd like you to show your appreciation to Keith in the usual way for a wonderful talk. My final contribution this evening is to make the presentation of the Sir Bernard Crossland Cube to our guest speaker this evening.